Hello, general psychology students. The purpose of this short video is to highlight some of the main points that are presented in chapter 1 of your textbook. I'm going to now go to share slides so we can look at the PowerPoint slides that are relevant to chapter 1. You have access to these under course content, under Unit 1 materials. If you scroll down, you'll see it'll say PowerPoint slides, and this is the chapter 1 PowerPoint slides. So we're going to talk today about the Introduction to Psychology chapter. And let me just go to the next slide. Here we go. Okay, so the beginning of the chapter really wants us to talk about the definition of psychology. What is psychology? And so the definition of psychology basically is the scientific study of mind and behavior. That's the definition of psychology. Psyche actually means the soul, but it was created at a time where the soul and the mind were sort of thought of as the same thing, where now I think most of us see them as very different. And then ology means the study of. So initially it was the study of the soul, but at a time when the soul meant the mind, the heart, the soul, sort of all combined. Now when we think of psychology, we really mean the scientific study of mind and behavior. Another definition of psychology that I love is the scientific study of how individuals think, feel, and behave. Because that's really what we're interested in. We scientifically study how each of us as individuals and then as groups of individuals, how we think about ourselves and each other and the environment and what's going on around us, how we feel about all of these things, and then how we behave in these different circumstances. And so that's the basic, that is sort of what psychology is about. So you can see in my discussion of it, I talked about how it's the scientific study, no matter what definition you use, it's going to begin with the scientific study. That is the bedrock of psychology. If you don't understand science, you cannot understand psychology. If we're interested in the mind and behavior, interested how individuals think, feel, and behave, but we're not going to use the scientific study. That's more philosophy, maybe even religion. So we're going to, as psychology people, we're going to use the scientific method to do this. And so the whole second chapter that we're going to cover, chapter 2, is all about research methods and basically using the scientific method. Super important for anyone who's going to study psychology. And because we're using, because it is a science, psychology is a science, we call it a social science. We are going to just harp on continually critical thinking. It is huge that you become a great critical thinker, learn to develop that skill of critical thinking in order to be a good scientist, in order to be able to study psychology well. So it's a bedrock, one of the most important fundamental skills that all people who study psychology need to know. Oh, and this is, okay. So the next part of the chapter is going to talk about the history of psychology. Like, how did we get to where we are now? And it's like any kind of history. You don't understand where you are now unless you sort of know what came before you. Many of you are traditional age, you're between 18 and 22, and you're probably really spending a lot of time trying to answer the question of who am I? What do I want to do with my life? And in doing that, you have to ask the question of where do I come from? What are my parents like? What are my grandparents like? What are my aunts and uncles like? What are my great-grandparents like? What were their experiences, their life experiences like? What did they take from all of those experiences that then they have given to me and told me about, well, this is how the world works. So I'm a good deal older than most of you, but my parents grew up in the had sort of evolved of age in the 1950s, coming right out of World War II, when there was this real sense that everyone should own their own house and move out of the city and advertising became really huge, and everyone, there were very specific roles of what women did and very specific roles about what men did. And there was this sense of conforming to these roles, and money was very important. That if you didn't have enough money, you wouldn't be able to do the things that you wanted to do. And perhaps that came from the fact that many of the parents of those people had lived through the Depression. And in the Depression era, there was so little that there was this sense of, if you have money, you'll be okay. So in those children who were brought up in that era then thought, as long as we have money, we're okay. So then people in my era were brought up by these parents who thought money was really important. And we were sort of like, we don't know if that's what needs to happen. Maybe some of these roles that constrict behavior need to change. And then I had my kids and how much that has changed. And so for you to understand yourself, you need to understand where you came from and what was given to you as far as what's important in the world and what you need to be okay, what you need to be safe and to grow and be happy. So same thing with psychology. Where do we come from? So William Wundt, there's two Williams, Wilhelm Wundt and William James were two, probably the first two big figures in psychology that we give credit to, both in the 1800s. William Wundt wrote his big book, Principles of Physiological Psychology in 1873. And we call William Wundt the founder of structuralism. And what he really believed, or he was trying to understand, the structure or the characteristics of the mind. Now, when he means mind, he doesn't mean the brain. They weren't at that point doing autopsies and looking at what piece of the brain did what. When he talks about the mind, he's really talking about how we think, feel, and what leads us to behave the way that we do. He thought that really what we need to do is understand all the little pieces of it, and then we'll understand how it all works together. And so he wanted to understand the different structures. And he thought the best way to do this was through introspection. And with introspection, you basically look to yourself and figure out, what did you go to do this? So if I said to you, I'd like you to memorize these 25 words on a list, and I gave them to you and I asked you to memorize them, then what William Wundt might do is ask you, so what approach did you use to memorize those words? What did you do? Which ones, and then if I tested you, which one of the words did you think you got correct? Were the words that were toward the beginning of the list, did you get those more right, or the end of the list, or the middle of the list? What strategies did you use? Which ones were effective? So he used introspection, looking at your own behavior and your thoughts and your feelings as you're doing different tasks, to try to understand the structure of the mind. William James is the next theorist that the book talks about. And he's the first American psychologist. Wilhelm Wundt is in Germany. And William James becomes the father of functionalism. And he really takes off of the theory of evolution. Darwin's theory of evolution comes out, William James follows him. And so William James is trying to say, what is the function of each of the things that we think and feel and behave? What's the function of our mind? Because things that are functional are likely to let the species to continue living and survive and get those genes into the gene pool, and those things should continue. So his idea was that these behaviors should be adaptive. Adaptive behaviors are the ones that should continue. Adaptive ways of thinking should be the ones that continue, not just within a person, but along generations. So he's really trying to understand human behavior and thoughts and feelings and psychology by looking at the function of different things. What's adaptive? He's looking at how the mind helps an organism fit into the environment, fit in and survive well in an environment. Okay, then the next theorist comes along, and I know you've heard of him, Sigmund Freud. And so Freud comes along in the 1920s and just takes over psychology. Um, I love taking these free courses through Coursera, and Coursera's Coursera's course on general psychology or introduction to psychology. The person who teaches it is at Yale, and he says that really Freud and Skinner are the two people who began psychology. That psychology would not be where it is today without Freud and Skinner. These are our giants. And so Freud comes up with the psychoanalytic theory. We're going to spend a lot of time in the personality chapter going through his theory. And he really believes that so much of what we think and feel and behave, we're completely unaware of. It's what he calls it's unconscious, and that these unconscious drives lead us to do all different things. And even though most of us don't believe much of what Freud says, in fact, if you go to most psychology departments, there's very little going on with Freud. If you want to learn more about Freud, other than in a general psychology class, most of the time you'll find more information about him in an English department. We've sort of said he played a big role and it's over. But one of the things that he did is he said, he was scientific for his time, but when we look back on it, his theories, you can't observe what he's talking about. We can't observe the unconscious. We can't use empiricism. We can't measure and test much of what he says. And if it's untestable, we don't really like it anymore. We want everything to be measurable in psychology now. So behaviorism comes sort of like the pendulum swing to behaviorism from Freud's psychoanalytic theory, because behaviorism says if we can't see it, then we don't even want to study it. They even talk about the black box. All thinking is in the black box. We're going to ignore that. We just want to focus on stimulus, behavior, stimulus, behavior. And so John Watson becomes the father of behaviorism. And we have a whole chapter called Learning, the psychology, and there's a whole course called Psychology of Learning that really focuses on behaviorism. And we'll talk a lot about Pavlov and Skinner and Watson, who are all behaviorists. Oh, this is Skinner, another big behaviorist, very important. Okay, there's also Gestalt psychology that came to play. This was mainly in Germany, Wertheimer, Kafka, Kohler, and the Gestalt psychologists really were interested in not piecing apart different types of behavior, but looking at a person in a more holistic way. And so they use as an example a cat. A cat has whiskers, a cat has a body, a cat has ears, a cat has a tail. If you just study the tail and the whiskers and the body and the ears, will you really understand a cat? And they would say no, that to understand the cat, you have to see how all these things play together and work together in a holistic form. And so Gestalt psychologists really help move the field forward away from it being so compartmentalized. And then we've got the humanistic psychologists like Maslow. And these humanistic psychologists, they really took over the field, and they sort of came out of the Gestalt ideas in saying that to really help human behavior, we need to understand the human in some kind of a totality and understand the human being as a human being. One of the humanistic theorists is Carl Rogers, and he believes in order for each of us to be psychologically healthy, we need to have at least one person in our life who gives us unconditional positive regard. One person who will regard us positively, who will love us, who will think that we're amazing, and we don't have to do anything to earn that. If you talk to many people, they'll be able to tell you who that person was. So for me, I had a grandmother who I could tell when I walked in the room, she was just so excited I was there. And it seemed like I could go on and on and on in a story, when I'm 5, going on and on and on. Probably anyone else would listen and go, get to the point. Or anyone else would listen and say, stop going, so often, or stop, wiggling as you're talking and all this kind of thing. But my grandmother, she never seemed to, none of my quirkiness bothered her at all. She seemed to hang on every word that I said and just seemed delighted to listen to me. And so I know myself, I'm really excited to have grandchildren, to perhaps be able to play that role in their lives. Carl Rogers thinks that a lot of people who have psychological issues will end up in therapy, and a great role for a therapist is to give that positive, unconditional positive regard. Another very famous humanistic psychologist is Maslow, and Maslow gave us his hierarchy of needs, which is shown in this diagram. We're going to talk about him quite a bit and his hierarchy of needs in the personality chapter. And coming out of all of this comes the cognitive revolution. Oh, there's Carl Rogers. I was talking about him before. Comes the cognitive revolution. So when I was in graduate school in the 1980s and 1990s, cognitive psychology just took over everything. And we were really interested in how people think, how we use language, and about how the language that we use actually affects how we think, and vice versa. And it took over everything, and it was wonderful. Right now, many people argue that we're sort of in a biological or maybe even a neuroscience revolution, where that has sort of taken over psychology. So much of what we're interested in now is how our neurotransmitters and the wiring of our brain and how that ends up affecting our behavior and our thoughts and our feelings. Also, there's a big impact of multicultural psychology. We realize how for a long time, psychologists tended to really be written about and for white men, and how limiting that was. And so there's now a whole field of psychology, feminist psychology. There's many psychologists of all different ethnicities who have, and from all different countries, who have brought a lot to the field. And now we like to see it as very interdisciplinary, both sexes, all different kinds of sexes, and also very unified in terms of race and ethnicity and that kind of thing. Now, when we look at psychology, there are definite fields that we look at. So sensation and perception is a field that this has to do with how we think and feel. How we perceive information through our senses. We are going to cover this in this Unit 1 information. So this is the history of psychology, or the introduction to psychology chapter. Then there's a chapter on research method. It's going to focus on the scientific method. Then there's a chapter on biopsychology, and then there's a chapter on sensation and perception. And those 4 chapters make up the first unit that we're going to cover. By the time the course is over, we'll talk about lifespan human growth and development, how people change from crib or cradle to coffin, as we like to say, from the beginning to the end, how we change physically, how we change intellectually, how we change socially, and all of that is very helpful in understanding how humans think, feel, and behave. And then this is comes from personality theorists. We're going to talk, we have a whole chapter on personality psychology. My area of psychology is social psychology. It's the scientific study of how individuals think, feel, and behave in social situations. How do other people affect us? We talk about obedience and compliance and stereotyping and all different kinds of things. Most psychologists now believe in the biopsychosocial model, where we believe that biology plays a role in what you think, feel, and behave. Also, your mind and your mindset, your psychology, your mental health affects how you think, feel, and behave. And then socially, the parents that are around you, your sisters and brothers, your classmates, the social environment, the cultural environment that you live in also plays a role. And these 3 things all combine together to help us be able to predict how you're thinking, feeling, and behaving in a given situation. And cognitive behavioral therapists. See, so much of this ends up affecting therapy. So right now, one of the big therapies that's out there is cognitive behavior therapy. And basically it says that if we can change the way we think about things, we can change how we feel about them, and that changes our behavior. And how all three of it, our behavior affects our thoughts, our behavior affects our emotions affect our thoughts and our behaviors. These three things all interconnect. And cognitive behavioral therapists help the clients to be able to reframe their thoughts and focus their emotions and control some of their behaviors that will lead to thoughts and emotions that they might be more wanting to have. So it's a big empirically validated therapy that we think works great. The last part of the chapter, and I said this would be a short video, it's turning out not to be that short, but the last part of the chapter talks about what do people do who are interested in psychology. And most of them will go on and get a PhD, and they'll study either sensation and perception or cognitive psychology, development psychology, personality, social, industrial, organizational, health psychology, sports and exercise psychology, clinical psychology or counseling psychology, forensic psychology. There's all these different areas. A lot of them will work at universities where they'll teach these kinds of things and do research on them. A lot of them will work for the government, like we had a grant with the Army Research Lab, and there were lots of PhD psychology people that did that too. And so many people will go on for PhD. Now a PhD or graduate degree, the majority of psychology people, I'm not sure if it's the majority, but a good percentage of psychology people do go on to graduate school to either become a therapist or to get a PhD and pursue one of the different areas. But not everyone does. If you graduate with an undergraduate degree, like a Bachelor of Arts, or here at Cameron we offer the Bachelor of Science in psychology, the #1 job that people with that degree have is that they become mid-level and high-level managers. So, I mean, imagine, like, if you major in this, if you major in psychology, you understand human behavior. Who better to have as a manager? Who better to have as a salesperson? Who better to have as a teller at a bank? And so psychology majors go on and do a whole bunch of things. Sometimes it doesn't even look like they majored in psychology, but they're using those skills all the time. Okay, I hope you found this video helpful in covering the main parts of chapter 1. I think a great thing to do next would be to look at the study guide for Unit 1, or it's the study guide for all of Unit 1, and look at the questions that are there for chapter 1 and write out those answers. I think the first one says something like, when does psychology get named or known to be a scientific study or its unique discipline? So that's in the 1800s with William Wundt and William James. And so if you go through and answer those questions by using the book, these PowerPoint slides, the video, I think you'll know that you understand chapter 1 very well. I'm going to post another video that covers chapter 2. And after you read chapters 1 and 2 and watch the videos and the PowerPoint slides for chapters 1 and 2, you'll be able to take that quiz that covers just chapter 1 and 2 that's worth 32 points. That lets you know if the study strategy that you're using is going to work for this semester. All right. Please, if you have any questions at all, email me, maryd@cameron.edu. I look forward to hearing from you. Thank you.